Do you get Labor Day off? Cool. Here's what they never told you at the cookout. That long weekend was born from a strike so messy, the president rushed a new holiday through Congress while trains burned. Labor Day was not a gift. It was damage control. Picture this. Your boss cuts your pay by a third, but your rent? Same price. Your landlord? Same guy who cut your pay. That was Pullman in 1894. And somehow, that mess gave you your September day off. This is not the story they teach in school. This is about rent bills, train fires, and a young woman whose speech changed everything. I will show you the receipts, the headlines, and how one strike became so scary that Congress basically said, "Here, have a holiday, please do not revolt." Let me paint you a picture of the weirdest town in America. Imagine living in a place where your boss owns your house, your grocery store, your library, and even the newspaper. That was not some dystopian movie. That was Pullman, Illinois in 1894. George Pullman built this perfect town for his railroad car workers. Nice houses, pretty parks, everything clean and organized. Sounds good, is it not? Wrong. Your paycheck? Company paycheck. Your house? Company house. Your groceries? Company store. Even the books you read? Company library. You could not own anything. You could not vote on town rules. Heck, you could not even have a beer because Pullman thought alcohol was bad for productivity. But here's where it gets really messed up. In 1893, the whole country crashed into a huge economic depression called the Panic of 1893. Banks failed. People lost everything. George Pullman's company was losing money too. So what did he do? He cut everyone's wages by 25 to 30%. Some workers saw their pay chopped in half. But rent? Rent stayed exactly the same. Grocery prices at the company store? Same high prices. Do the math. Your paycheck drops by a third. Your rent stays the same. The store prices? Same. What's your first move? These were not numbers on a page. These were real families sitting at kitchen tables, staring at bills they could not pay. Maria, a seamstress at the Pullman plant, made 60 cents a day before the cut. After, 40 cents. Her rent? Still $14 a month. She was working full-time and could not afford to live in her own home. And remember, you cannot just move. Who is hiring during a depression? Where would you go? Pullman owned your world. By May 1894, people were desperate. Families were choosing between rent and food. Some workers were getting paychecks with 2 cents left after rent was taken out. 2 cents for a month's work. So the workers did something brave. They picked 3 guys to speak for everyone and asked for a meeting with George Pullman himself. Not a riot, not demands, just a conversation. They walked into his office and said, "Mr. Pullman, we cannot survive on these wages. Our kids are hungry. Could you maybe lower the rent a little? Or give us back some of our pay?" You know what Pullman said? Business is business. I cannot lower rent because that is a separate investment, but I can always find new workers who will take these wages. Then he fired all 3 guys who came to talk to him. That was it. The breaking point. On May 11, 1894, the factory floor went silent. Workers set down their tools and walked out. Not just some workers, almost everyone. 3,000 people said enough at the same time. But here's the thing about strikes in 1894. If you are just one factory, one company, one town, you are probably going to lose. Big companies can wait you out. They have got money. You do not. These Pullman workers needed help, and help was about to come from a guy named Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was not some rich guy playing politics. He started as a railroad worker, climbing around hot locomotive engines, breathing smoke and coal dust every day. By 1894, he was running something new called the American Railway Union, the ARU. Most unions back then only let in certain kinds of workers. Engineers in one union, firemen in another, brakemen somewhere else. If you were just the guy loading cargo, good luck. Debs said that was stupid. He wanted every railroad worker skilled, unskilled, white, black, immigrant, native, born in one big union. Stronger together, you know? The ARU was growing fast, really fast. By 1894, they had 150,000 members. That is like having every single railroad worker from Chicago to California in your corner. So when those Pullman workers asked for help, Debs had a choice. He could say, "Sorry, not our problem," and stay safe. Or he could risk everything for people he had never met. In June 1894, the ARU held their convention in Chicago. That is when everything changed. A young woman named Jenny Curtis stood up to speak. She was 19 years old, a seamstress at the Pullman plant, and she was furious. She told the room exactly what life was like in Pullman. How her pay got cut but rent did not. How families were starving while George Pullman lived in a mansion. How workers got fired just for asking questions. But here's what got everyone: she did not just complain. She looked around that room of tough railroad workers and said, "We are not asking you to strike for us. We are asking you to remember that what happens to us today happens to you tomorrow." The room went dead quiet. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone was on their feet shouting. Debs knew this was dangerous, really dangerous. But he also knew Jenny was right. "No more Pullman cars," he announced. "If the Pullman company will not treat workers fairly, we will not handle their cars." That might sound simple, but it was like dropping a bomb on the railroad system. Here's how railroads worked in 1894. Picture a giant spiderweb covering the entire country. Every thread connected to every other thread. Break one thread, and the whole web starts shaking. Pullman cars were not just luxury coaches for rich people. They were attached to almost every passenger train in America. Mail trains, freight trains, everything. So when ARU workers said, "We will not touch Pullman cars," they were not just making a statement. They were jamming the entire system. A train would roll into Chicago with a Pullman car attached. ARU workers would unhook it and set it aside. "You want to move this train? Remove the Pullman car." Railroad companies said no. "The Pullman car stays. That is our contract." ARU workers said, then the train does not move. And the trains stopped moving. Within a week, it was chaos. Freight backed up in rail yards from Chicago to San Francisco. Mail sat in bags, undelivered. Passenger trains canceled. Food rotted in cars that could not move. The numbers were insane. By early July, 25,000 workers had joined the boycott across 27 states. 29 different railroad companies were affected. It was like someone had turned off the circulatory system of the entire country. In Chicago, the biggest rail hub in America, the yards looked like graveyards. Miles and miles of silent trains. No whistles, no chugging, just stillness. People started calling it the Debs Rebellion. But while the workers celebrated, someone else was getting very, very angry. The railroad companies were not just going to sit there and lose money. They had friends in Washington, powerful friends. And that is when things got really ugly. Meet Richard Olney. He was President Cleveland's Attorney General, which means he was basically the country's top lawyer. But here's what is crazy. Before he worked for the government, Olney was a railroad lawyer. He literally used to work for the companies that were now begging for help. Olney looked at this strike and saw something that terrified him. Not just workers demanding better pay, but workers who were actually winning. And if workers could shut down the railroads by working together, what else could they shut down? So Olney dusted off a law called the Sherman Antitrust Act. This law was supposed to break up big monopolies. You know, the massive companies that controlled entire industries. But Olney had a clever idea. What if we use this law against the union instead? He argued that the ARU was restraining trade by not handling Pullman cars. He convinced federal judges that this strike was actually illegal under anti-monopoly laws. On July 2, 1894, federal judges issued something called an injunction. Basically, a court order that said Eugene Debs and all ARU members must immediately stop the boycott. Anyone who disobeys goes to jail. Debs read this court order and basically said, "Make me." So President Cleveland did. Cleveland was a Democrat, but he was old-school Democrat. He believed the government should protect business and keep order. He did not care about workers' rights. But here's where it gets really controversial. Illinois had its own governor, John Altgeld. And Altgeld said, "Mr. President, we do not need federal troops. We can handle this ourselves." Cleveland ignored him. On July 3, 1894, he sent 12,000 federal troops to Chicago. Think about that. The President of the United States sent an army to break up a labor strike, not because local officials asked for help, not because there was some emergency, but because railroad companies wanted their trains moving again. Governor Altgeld was furious. He wrote a letter to Cleveland that basically said, "You have no right to invade my state without my permission. This is unconstitutional." Cleveland wrote back, "I will send troops wherever I want to protect the mail and interstate commerce." And just like that, Chicago became a battlefield. Before the troops arrived, the strike had been mostly peaceful. Sure, some trains were not moving, but nobody was getting hurt. The moment federal soldiers marched into Chicago with loaded rifles, everything changed. Picture this. You are a railroad worker who has been peacefully refusing to work on Pullman cars. Suddenly, armed soldiers are pointing guns at you and telling you to get back to work. How would you feel? Some workers said, "Fine, we will go back." But others got angry, really angry. By July 6th, the rail yards were chaos. Crowds of workers and supporters faced off against federal troops. Someone threw a rock, someone else pushed. Then someone started a fire. Railroad cars began burning, not just a few hundreds. The sky over Chicago filled with black smoke. You could see the fires from miles away. The newspapers went crazy. Headlines screamed about anarchy and revolution. Photos showed burning train cars and soldiers with bayonets. But here's what the newspapers did not always mention: who started the violence. Many witnesses said federal troops provoked the crowds. Some suspected that railroad companies hired troublemakers to start fights and make the strikers look bad. Either way, by the end of that week, at least 30 people were dead. Hundreds more were injured. Millions of dollars in railroad property had burned. And Eugene Debs? On July 10th, federal marshals arrested him for violating the court injunction. With their leader in jail and the army on the streets, the ARU broke apart. Workers started trickling back to their jobs. The boycott collapsed. The railroad companies had won, but the victory came with a price, and that price was Labor Day. Here's where the story gets really interesting. While Chicago burned and workers got shot, something weird was happening in Washington. Congress was nervous, really nervous. Think about it from their perspective. A strike had just shut down 27 states. Federal troops were shooting American workers in the streets. Eugene Debs was becoming a national hero to millions of working people. And all this violence was creating something politicians hated: martyrs. Dead workers make great symbols for revolution. Angry workers might vote for radical candidates. Or worse, they might decide voting does not work and try something more dramatic. So while the Pullman Strike was still burning, Congress did something that seems completely random. They created Labor Day. On June 28, 1894, right in the middle of the strike chaos, President Cleveland signed a law making Labor Day a federal holiday. The timing was not an accident. It was damage control. But here's the really sneaky part. They chose September, not May. See, workers around the world celebrated May Day on May 1st. That tradition started in Chicago back in 1886, after police killed workers who were protesting for an 8-hour workday. May Day was radical, international, and connected to some pretty violent history. September was safe. September was American. September had no connection to bombs or anarchists or revolution. The message was clear. We will give you a holiday to celebrate work, but it is going to be our kind of holiday. Parades and picnics and speeches about the American dream, not revolution. Labor Day was not a gift from a generous government. It was a bribe to keep workers from burning down the system. And you know what? It kind of worked. Eugene Debs spent his time in jail reading, a lot of reading, books about socialism, economics, political theory. He went into prison as a union leader who just wanted fair wages. He came out as a revolutionary who thought the entire capitalist system was broken. But first, he had to deal with his legal problems. The government charged Debs with contempt of court for ignoring the federal injunction. His lawyers argued that the whole injunction was unconstitutional. The federal government had no right to break up a strike just because it hurt business. In 1895, the case reached the Supreme Court. It was called In re Debs, and it was one of the most important labor cases in American history. The Supreme Court sided with the government, unanimously. They ruled that the federal government could break any strike that interfered with interstate commerce or mail delivery. They said that protecting the economy was more important than workers' rights to organize. This decision was a disaster for the labor movement. It gave the federal government unlimited power to crush strikes by claiming they hurt business. For the next 40 years, anytime workers went on strike, companies could run to federal court and get an injunction to stop them. Debs served 6 months in prison. When he got out, he was a changed man. He had decided that you could not fix capitalism, you had to replace it. He spent the rest of his life running for president as a socialist, giving speeches about workers' rights and arguing that democracy meant economic democracy, not just political democracy. The Pullman Strike had created America's most famous socialist. So what happened to everyone else? The striking Pullman workers? Most of them lost. They went back to work at the same low wages. Many got blacklisted, secretly marked as troublemakers so no other company would hire them. The Pullman Company kept operating, but the town of Pullman did not last. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court forced George Pullman to sell off the town. They ruled that a private company could not own an entire municipality. Score 1 for democracy. The ARU never recovered. By 1897, it was basically dead. But the idea behind it that all workers in an industry should stick together did not die. 30 years later, similar unions would help create the modern labor movement. Eugene Debs became the most famous radical in America. He ran for president 5 times as a socialist. In 1912, he got almost 1 million votes. During World War I, he went to prison again for opposing the war, and he ran for president from his jail cell in 1920. President Cleveland? His use of federal troops against the strike hurt him politically. Many Democrats never forgave him for siding with big business against workers. And Labor Day? It became exactly what the politicians wanted: a nice, safe holiday about American workers and American values. Parades and barbecues instead of revolution. But here's what is interesting about holidays. Once you create them, they take on a life of their own. Even though Labor Day started as political damage control, it gave workers a day to remember their history. Union leaders could give speeches. Families could talk about work and fairness and what they deserved. Over time, Labor Day became both things: a government-approved celebration and a reminder of what workers could accomplish when they stuck together. So what does any of this have to do with you? Well, first off, every time you get a 3-day weekend in September, you are experiencing the aftermath of federal troops shooting workers in Chicago. That is a weird thought, is it not? But there are bigger connections too. Remember the basic problem at Pullman. Wages went down, but the cost of living stayed the same. Sound familiar? Today, your boss probably does not own your apartment building. But does it feel like the person who sets your pay and the person who sets your rent are on the same team? When housing costs keep rising, but wages stay flat, you are facing the same math problem that Pullman workers faced in 1894. And what about the legal stuff? The Supreme Court ruled that the government could break strikes to protect interstate commerce. Today, companies still use courts to stop workers from organizing. They will claim that a strike hurts customers, or disrupts supply chains, or violates some contract. The weapons change, but the game stays the same. Here's another parallel. Back then, newspapers mostly sided with the railroad companies. They portrayed strikers as violent radicals who were hurting innocent people. Today, how do you think most media outlets cover strikes? Do they focus on workers' demands, or do they focus on the inconvenience to consumers? The Pullman Strike also showed the power of solidarity. When workers in 27 states decided to support each other, they brought the entire railroad system to its knees. Nobody could ignore them. Today, that looks like different things. Maybe it is fast food workers coordinating strikes across multiple cities. Maybe it is teachers in different states sharing strategies. Maybe it is workers using social media to organize across company lines. The tools change, but the principle is the same. Alone, you are just one person complaining. Together, you are a force that can shut things down. Here's the thing about Labor Day. Most people think it is just about celebrating work. You know, hooray for American workers and all that. But the real story is messier and more interesting. Labor Day exists because workers once got so fed up that they shut down half the country. The holiday is a receipt from that fight, a reminder that when people say, "Enough," the system has to respond. Sometimes that response is genuine reform. Sometimes it is just symbolic gestures designed to cool things off. But either way, change does not come from asking nicely. It comes from people standing together and refusing to accept things as they are. The next time you are grilling burgers on Labor Day, remember Jenny Curtis, the 19-year-old seamstress who stood up in front of 150,000 railroad workers and changed history. Remember Eugene Debs, who went to prison rather than abandon his principles. Remember the workers who decided that solidarity was more important than their individual safety. Labor Day is not just about getting Monday off. It is about the fact that ordinary people, when they work together, can force the most powerful institutions in the world to pay attention. And that is a lesson worth celebrating. Subscribe for more stories about how the past shapes your present and how understanding history can help you change the future.